This thing right here in my hand is the Vive Pro 2. It has been an adventure trying to get this review out. Stress testing, figuring out what I like and don't like about it, and this thing is full of compromises. In this video, I'm going to take a ton of time explaining everything I've learned about this headset and what maybe you would like or probably dislike about the headset itself. So please take a moment. This will be a very long video, but I guarantee this video will be very important for helping you make a decision on whether or not this will be your next headset. Okay, so the Vive Pro 2, it retails for $800 headset only. It requires Lighthouse base stations and controllers, and the full kit is around $1,300. Its probably greatest competitor is the Valve Index. The Valve Index by itself is $500, and the full kit is about $1,000. The way I reviewed this thing throughout all the stress testing I did throughout a week, and I'm talking about tons of hours, not just like a few hours a day, I'm talking about maybe 8 hours a day for the past week. I basically used this thing only and then went back to other headsets I own that are similar to it, mainly being the Vive Pro I and the Valve Index. For me, I'm very sensitive when I get used to something, and then when I go back to something that should be lower quality, I notice things right away. For this headset, I was actually happy to go back to some of my older headsets. That's not a good sign. Now first, I have to say, a lot of reviewers have already came out with this video. Especially some YouTubers from Europe, they got their units early, and I had no contact with HTC Vive, nor did they ever offer me the headset. I paid for it myself and had to wait for it to come out in the US. I was actually expecting this headset to be a lot worse, to be honest. Even though I've already started saying some negative things about it, people were saying it was worse than the Vive Cosmos, which I don't think that at all. However, it still has a mess of problems. So let's get into everything. First of all, I love the Lighthouse base station system. It's the best tracking system, and when I ever not use it, I actually feel kind of sad. Using markerless inside-out tracking systems such as the Quest 2 or Rift S, I immediately noticed some small similarities that make me always want to go back to Lighthouse. This headset is the successor to the Vive Pro, which it shows. It looks like the exact same housing as the Vive Pro, and it is. In fact, most of the things in this headset you see is exactly the same as its predecessor. That of course includes the actual housing, the cameras, the strap, and the foam pad. The speakers too, but they slightly upgraded the speakers, but we'll get to that in a little bit. The one big thing that they upgraded were the optics and the actual resolution of the display. It's using about a 5K resolution display, almost 2500 per eye. And they're using a very similar lens design to the Valve Index, a dual canted display that allows for a greater FOV. It does give a greater wide FOV, but there's a lot to be said about the vertical FOV, which we'll spend some time very soon talking about that. I want to first get into build quality. Well, right away upon opening this thing and setting it up, I want to say it's exactly what you expect from a Vive Pro. HTC has been usually very good with build quality. These things are like bricks and they're a lot harder to break than, for example, the Valve Index stuff. That being said, when I got my unit in, I actually thought my display was broken. There were some white spots showing on my left eye display, and I was very worried that maybe my display actually had, well, white spots. That's very common for LCD displays. Luckily, when I did my testing with the wireless kit, I realized it wasn't the display, it was actually the cable. So the cable that actually came with this headset right out of the box was broken. Luckily, I had another cable from my Vive Pro I was able to put in. That's not a really good sign. There's also been reports of actually the screen dying for people because of the way that the actual headset does not really turn itself off automatically. There's a button on the link box, which is the little box that you connect the wire into, and you have to press that button to turn it off. Otherwise, this thing is pretty much still on, even when it's not. And a lot of reports are coming in that people that are not pressing that button, their displays are burning to death. Right now, I am holding the headset with SteamVR off and everything, but the button on, and this thing is feeling hot. Now this is probably something that would be addressed in an actual update to the firmware. We'll talk about software and firmware in a little bit. There's a big complaint with that too. I mentioned that this device comes with the default foam pad. I am not using it on this headset, nor should anyone. And there's a big reason for that. The default foam pad for this headset, not only is it a disgusting, uncomfortable sponge that will sort of hurt your face the longer you wear it, but it actually makes your wide FOV lower. So all those gains you get from the new lens, HTC did not want to put a little bit more time and R&D into actually including a thinner base pad. So I'm using a VR cover to actually get the gains that this headset's advertising. Wow. And just like all the other Vive headsets, it uses Velcro. I freaking hate Velcro. I just pulled off this foam pad off of the headset, and I know it's hard to see on the camera, but you see this right here? This is a piece of the Velcro that's supposed to be sticking on the headset forever to allow me to interchange the foam pads. Well, I've always had this problem with Vive headsets and Vive Pro headsets. The adhesive they use is garbage. So the actual piece you're supposed to attach your foam pads to always come off. I hate that, and I much prefer the Valve Index's magnet system. It's so much better, and $800 for this crap. But I would say other than that, everything else in build quality, it's good. HTC is a very good manufacturing company. That's kind of why Valve chose them back when they did the HTC Vive. They were the best at the time. And they're still very good. But let's get right into some of the more important stuff. Let's talk about the optics. I mentioned how this thing is using a dual canted display to get a greater FOV. It's very true, it is. And it does give a much greater, wider FOV than the previous Vive Pro. But at a huge cost. You might have seen some people already talking about this, but the vertical FOV on this headset is actually really freaking bad. Basically, my experience explaining what it's like to use this headset while explaining the FOV, it feels like you're watching an ultra-wide movie, and when you look up or down, there's only black bars. Sort of like this. Could you imagine if I did the rest of the video like this? Well, that's what playing VR is like with this. Now, I will say I did get used to it pretty fast, but it's not ideal. Basically, this headset, the Vive Pro 2, is probably using the same exact panels and optics as the Vive Focus 3. But with the Vive Focus 3, they're actually using a completely different housing. This headset allows you to actually change how close the lens and the housing is to your face. However, it's nowhere near as close as the Valve Index can get to your eyes. And I think this is where the root of the problem really begins, with the weird FOV. The fact that they're using the same housing and design, which does not allow you to get the lens and display close enough to your face as the Valve Index, makes this weird wide and low vertical FOV a lot more pronounced than probably what the Vive Focus 3 will actually have. I bet you when that headset comes out and the embargoes are lifted, that headset's lenses will be able to go straight close up to your eyes. In fact, that's why I think a lot of the problems with this headset actually comes with the fact that all of the R&D costs were spent on the Vive Focus 3 to make a really good headset, most likely. And they took some of the R&D that they got while making the Vive Focus 3 and kind of stuffed it in this old housing with very low R&D. Which is why we got weird things such as the old face pad that doesn't even help you benefit with the FOV, this strange letterbox design, the fact that the cooling in this headset is actually terrible, which we'll get into very soon, the fact that you're still using the same cameras, and this garbage microphone. I've always hated the Vive Pro and Vive microphones. Not only is the placement terrible and it will constantly get your breath or any other weird noises that your mouth makes, but the audio quality has just always been bad. I remember when I was watching the announcement for this device, I was praying that they would mention one little thing about the microphone. And they mentioned something about audio, but they were only talking about the headphones, which they actually did upgrade the audio a bit. Some people are reporting that they're hearing a lot of buzzing in their headphones with these devices. For me, no issues. So I'm not sure if that's a compatibility issue with your hardware or just some other strange thing that's going on with USB. But for me, I actually do notice an actual much better audio quality than the Vive Pro I or Vive Pro 1. But the microphone, unchanged. It really sucks because the Valve Index microphone is nearly god tier. In fact, for a lot of my videos, I've only used the Valve Index microphone to record voiceovers. It's that good. Just imagine if everyone you ran into in VR, whether it be consumer or enterprise business, everyone talked like this, with this quality microphone. Beautiful, right? No, it's not. See what I mean? For an $800 headset, I really would like stuff like microphone audio quality to be good, or up to par. I do not want to do things such as attach a third-party microphone magnetically or with a sticker onto this thing. That sucks. Now let's talk about comfort, just a little bit. This headset is comfortable. I actually think it's a very good design. There's nothing wrong with the head strap design or really anything about it. The only issue is with these new lenses and new displays, this thing becomes a lot more front heavy. So over time, compared to my Vive Pro I, which I use a lot actually still, the back of your head is slowly pulling and giving you a bit of a headache a lot faster than using a Vive Pro I or Vive Pro 1. The comfort gets even worse with the cooling. This thing doesn't have the best cooling. And with the new displays, a 5K panel, it's gonna get hot. There's actually one thing I want to talk about when it comes to heat. By default, this thing already gets hot. But to talk about how it actually gets hotter for me, I need to pivot into talking about the actual displays and clarity. So keep this heat idea in your mind for just the next few minutes while I talk about displays and clarity. So first of all, this is a 5K resolution panel, and it is great. It runs at up to 120 Hertz, which is phenomenal if your system can run it. I am using a 5900X and a 3090 graphics card in my computer. And for a lot of games, some of the more heavier games, I am not reaching that frame rate for a lot of ways. And this is basically the best GPU you can get on the market. So again, this resolution at this frame rate is going to be hard to run for a lot of people. Not only that, is if you do not have a 20 series or 30 series, you don't even get the compression technology to actually get the higher resolution. You're forced to use lower resolutions that are later upscaled, which might be okay, but I mean, one of the selling points of this headset is the higher resolution and the higher refresh rate. Now let's talk about the clarity. Clarity is great. Reading text from far away with a high resolution is beautiful. I can actually read text a lot, just very easily. But let's talk about brightness. When I was using this for the first couple days, I felt the brightness in this headset was really low, especially for games like Half-Life Alyx, where I would be in areas where it's actually sunlit, but if there's a shadow being cast somewhere, that shadow felt way too dark, and I wouldn't be able to see any of the details of anything in that shadow. It was very jarring. Not only that, the lower brightness that would happen during these areas kind of washed out the colors. So then I started realizing, okay, is there any way to change the brightness? And there was, but not in the SteamVR or the Vive runtime, which we'll get into that later. There's a secret file in the Vive console's directory that talks about something called adaptive brightness. So basically, by default, without any way to turn off except for editing a string in a text file, the actual adaptive brightness is changing the brightness all the time with a delay, depending on what you're looking at in the environment. Which this functionality is actually a good idea, but I don't feel it's working well for this headset. So what I ended up doing is turning it off and making sure it's at its max brightness all the time. And I think Vive probably didn't really want people to do that, because when I said this thing ran hot before, wow, I noticed within 10 minutes of keeping it that adaptive brightness off that this thing ran mega hot. The cooling in this thing is not enough to really do well with it. And while the colors and all the shadows and maybe the black's not being black because this is an LCD panel, it was totally worth it for me to keep that brightness, adaptive brightness off. However, I also noticed another thing. When I'm in review mode, I do my best to notice the SDE or screen door effect as much as I can for all the headsets. So while in normal gameplay, you will not notice SDE. I want to say Despite the fact this has a 5K resolution panel, when you up that brightness and you're in a bright area and you're looking for it, yes, SDE still exists even on this headset. I actually noticed the SDE in sort of a similar way to the Index, despite the Index having a much lower resolution. I think the big reason for that is the pixel fill rate on this headset is actually lower. So while this has a lot more tinier pixels, there's a lot more lines in between, or at least the similar amount of width of lines between the pixels as the Valve Index. That being said, it's almost pointless to talk about screen door effect. It's definitely one of the best resolution panels, and it looks great when the adaptive brightness is off. And if it wasn't for the fact of that weird vertical FOV, then yeah, it's just weird. Let's actually do some FOV measurements. All right, things are about to get a little more boring. So please stay with me because I promise it's very important and I have to explain everything here. So what you're about to see is a bunch of results from a lot of different headsets using my own testing. The most two important numbers to look at is the number on the very top of each result and the result on the very right. These numbers show up the exact vertical and horizontal FOVs for each headset, at least for my eyes. All of these results obtained are with my IPD of about 65, which is about the average IPD. You'll see with the Vive Pro 2, the wide FOV is about 116 degrees, which is a pretty large number actually, and is very good. Those dual canted lenses are doing a lot. However, we start looking at the vertical FOV, and it's about 96. I already know what you're thinking, 96 is a lot, right? Well, let's look at a few other headsets. Let's start with the predecessor of the Vive Pro 2, the Vive Pro I or Vive Pro 1. With the results of this headset, you'll already notice there's a hugely balanced FOV between vertical and horizontal, about 102 to 103 degrees. This circular vision feels a lot more natural and might be the main reason why so many people are complaining about the vertical FOV feeling so much like a letterbox. Let's look at a few other headsets. Since the Valve Index came out, one of its best features has definitely been the FOV for a while. In fact, that's kind of one of the maintaining features that it has over a lot of the competition these days. And again, you're seeing a very balanced FOV result, at about 109 to 110 for vertical and horizontal. The vertical FOV of 110 is almost a 15 degrees difference between it and the Vive Pro 2, despite being a cheaper headset and being older. This is also important because the Vive Pro 2 and the Index also use almost the exact same lens design. So the fact that the Vive Pro 2 is not getting a near similar result in this sort of balance doesn't personally look good for the Vive Pro 2 in my opinion. Finally, just for a little bit of fun, let's throw in the Oculus Quest 2's result. Again, another very balanced FOV, 95 with 95. If you haven't noticed the pattern by now, it's that most other consumer headsets that have been praised so highly have been using this very balanced FOV for both wide and vertical. Oculus Quest 2 obviously has one of the lower FOVs, and that's why a lot of people explain it to be more of a binocular headset, but again, it's a cheaper headset and it's not using dual canted lens. But due to that, there's something I really want to show off as well. Do you see that stereo overlap percentage on the bottom left? Stereo overlap is very important. And let's just go over these results real quick while focusing on the stereo overlap. The stereo overlap percentage with the Vive Pro 2 with my eyes were about 65%. That's actually pretty low, and why I think I had a lot of weird problems when I was first using it throughout the week. The Vive Pro I, for example, almost reaches about 90%. That's nearly a perfect overlap and looks a lot more natural with an actual stereoscopic view. I feel it's very important for me to actually admit that these dual canted lenses are actually always going to kind of sacrifice some stereo overlap to get the wider FOV. That's sort of one of the downsides of this lens system. However, if we look at the Valve Index, the stereo overlap is almost 80%, which is why I never really noticed this strange sort of, dare I call it, distortion in between my two eyes. 80% compared to about 65% is a huge difference, and really combine that with the low vertical field of view, and things just look really off and less immersive in my opinion. So after that very long spiel, which I probably lost a lot of viewers, let's talk about the thing I talked about near the end, the stereo overlap. To explain exactly what the stereo overlap is, it's basically a perfect stereo overlap will allow your eyes to perfectly match something in between each other. Imagine I'm holding up this fist, and there's two displays showing this. When those displays come together to create a stereoscopic image, this fist should be lined up perfectly. Whereas actually, this fist might actually be being cut off by one eye, which adds a lot of weirdness for your brain and your viewing. And despite this that I said brightness was bothering me and the weird colors, I would say this is what was driving me nuts the most. For a while I've been used to headsets with a much better binocular overlap. And this headset has one of the worst that I've ever tried. Binocular overlap is very important. And while again, I said that these candid displays will sacrifice some binocular overlap, I feel this headset maybe sacrifices way too much. So when you look closely centered to your vision around your eyes, things just look weird. And that's the one thing I probably can't get over more than the weird FOV or the weird brightness if I couldn't change that. It's just bad. In fact, I would even say that one factor makes me not want to recommend this headset to anyone. It's just rough. It's weird. I actually feel it's the most consumer unfriendly thing that a lot of new people that might try out this headset, they'll notice something weird and not be able to figure it out. They might even think there's something wrong with their computer or the frame rate projecting frames when it's none of those things, and I guarantee it's the binocular overlap. Okay, enough about that. Let's complain about something else that probably most people don't care about. Let's talk about SteamVR. Recently I made a video about pretty much complaining about how SteamVR is in a mega buggy state and I had to constantly restart it. Well, imagine if I had to deal with SteamVR and something called HTC Vive Console, which this headset requires to run too. Wow. So when the Vive Cosmos came out, it also was requiring the Vive Console. It's basically its own runtime that runs with SteamVR, and some of the settings are actually in there, including one setting called motion smoothing. Motion smoothing is very similar to ASW or asynchronous space warp that Oculus uses. Whenever your GPU is not reaching the right amount of frames, it will synthetically create frames to sort of make a smeared image to make up for the drop frame. This headset is not able to use SteamVR's built-in one, so HTC provided their own. And it's the worst one I've ever seen so far. In fact, for me, I never used motion smoothing to begin with, and just to turn on the HTC's motion smoothing, I really was never going to use that one. So with motion smoothing, you get a sort of a smeared image, as I said, but with HTC's, imagine that smearing also being blocky and pixely. That's the best way I can describe it. Keep it off forever, it's useless and terrible. The runtime is also how you change your resolution. And with it, yeah, you have to restart it and the SteamVR runtime. And restarting SteamVR itself is something you have to do constantly due to all the bugs. And with the freaking Vive console runtime, it adds about 15 seconds to the whole startup process. It takes that long for me to actually start it up. And while the actual runtime is not actually taking that many things up in terms of resources in the background, I still hate a lot of runtimes. In fact, closing this runtime a few times, 3 times this week, made my computer freeze completely. I had to go and almost remeasure all my FOV measurements because I was writing it in a notepad while I was testing it. And then when I finally finished it, I didn't save the notepad file, and then I closed SteamVR, which automatically closes Vive Console, and when Vive Console was closing down, dead. I hate a lot of runtimes in the background. In fact, that's one of the greatest things about OpenXR coming out. Is things such as eye tracking and a bunch of other features that require separate runtimes usually are all going to be built into this one runtime thing. And it's great. I love you, OpenXR. Please become standard very soon. Wait a minute. I just mentioned the E word. Or I word. Eye tracking. When they announced this thing, I was originally pissed. I'm not gonna lie. I was expecting this thing to have built-in eye tracking because the Vive Pro I was honestly one of the greatest headsets I ever used from the company. It was using Tobii eye tracking and it worked great with the Vive mouth tracker. And eye tracking in itself is gonna be something I guarantee, screen cap this or clip this. A year from this video, you're gonna see some major headsets coming out with eye tracking built in. Even face tracking built in too. Again, the fact that this doesn't have it already is going to make this headset behind in a year, I guarantee. So this thing is compatible with the mouth tracker. And mouth tracking is awesome. But in my opinion, mouth tracking is actually not worth it without eye tracking built in as well. So the fact that you can plug in a mouth tracker to this thing, great, you can have mouth tracking. But no built-in eye tracking makes it weird. Let's just I promise. It's something I've tested myself. And I know what people are gonna say. Brad, there's a third-party product coming out that allows you to attach eye tracking to your headset. Well, first of all, that thing will not be using Toby's SDK and will probably require its own runtime as well. Not to mention that the actual current eye and face tracking runtime by Vive actually is another runtime that needs to run as well. So let's say this thing had eye tracking from that third-party kit and a mouth tracker, which not only the fact that you only have one USB port inside here, which is a very awkward place. I mean, look at that. Yeah, pull this weird thing off. It's terrible. You would have to make a hub to be able to plug into two things. So you have the SteamVR runtime. You have the Vive console runtime. You have the third-party eye tracking runtime, and then you would have the face tracking runtime. And then you add some overlays, such as maybe Over Toolkit, or FPS VR, or OverVR advanced settings, and then your game. That is way too much stuff to be running at once, and I hate the idea of that. Yes, this might be something that doesn't really convince you anytime soon, but I think the lack of built-in eye tracking makes this headset gimped in the near future. Especially the fact that it's such a high-resolution panel, any form of eye-tracked FOV rendering would benefit it a lot. Yeah. I really don't know what to say. Like, I feel like I've been trashing on this product the whole video. I mean, I definitely was, right? But all in all, it's not terrible, except for the binocular overlap. It's just nowhere near worth $800 by itself. If someone wants to spend $800 for a truly futuristic headset, I actually think the Vive Pro I, its predecessor coming out in 2019, is a lot more forward-thinking than this thing. This thing just has panel and optics, and it's not perfect. It's just a flawed headset. And I know the fact that HTC is a struggling company for a lot of ways, and basically they did not have a lot of R&D given to them by the executives to work on this. All this product is the culmination of R&D spent on the Vive Focus 3, and then some engineers grabbing some of that R&D and stuffing it into this with as little money as they had to do. So personally, I wouldn't really recommend this headset to anyone. I just think it's overpriced, and literally if you can wait 1 year, I bet you will see something that makes this thing look pitiful. Which is sad, because I was actually really getting excited for this headset, and I probably could have overlooked a lot of things if it just had built-in eye tracking and a better binocular overlap. Other than that, that's it. I know I talked a very long time, but that's everything I have to say. This has been a very difficult video for me. I spent a lot of time with a lot of sleepless nights trying to figure out what I'm going to say without sounding too biased. But really, I am biased because I was excited and this thing let me down. And I don't want it to let any of you guys down either. So if you like this video, please like, subscribe, and check out bradsmells.com. And have a great day. Bye!